Hello, and welcome to the next panel of the Raben Respite Programming, Courting Our Future, hosted by the Constitutional Accountability Center. I'm your moderator, Elie Mystal. You might know me as the Justice Correspondent from The Nation. You also might know me from screaming about the Mets on Twitter. Joining me for today's discussion is Elizabeth Wydra. She is the she's the president of the Constitutional Accountability Center. She's appeared as a legal expert on basically every television cable network that you can think of, and in most print publications that you've read. And I did not know this until reading up on her. She also, like me, used to be a big law associate at Quinn Emanuel, which means the two of us share something in common. We used to make a ton of money, and now we don't. Also joining me is Elliot Williams. He is a principal at the Raben Group. He's in the government affairs practice. Elliot spent 8 years in the Obama administration, which means he did not make a lot of money. He's a former federal prosecutor and used to, in a former life, be judiciary counsel for Chuck Schumer, who is now the Senate Minority Leader. So that's our panel. We're going to talk about the courts. Folks, if you have been watching the Democratic National Convention that's been going on this week, you might be surprised to learn that the Supreme Court exists. It's actually a thing. There are 3 constitutional branches of government, and the Supreme Court is one of them. So, Elliot, really, my first question is to you. Why are the Democrats so bad at this? Why are the Democrats kind of unable to really make a case about why the courts are important to their voters? How many times does Mitch McConnell have to stuff Democrats into a locker before they kind of get what's going on? Like, you've worked in the government, you've worked for Democratic administrations. Elliot, please tell us why do we not talk about this enough?
And that's a very, very important question, Ellie. And so just big picture, I think Democrats simply do not vote on the judiciary as single issue voters in the way that Republicans or conservatives do. And that has an impact on how Democratic leaders approach talking about and thinking about the courts. Use just like a really important real world example, which is the State of the Union, which is every year the president gives a State of the Union address, which is a reflection of his or hers, but his views for the party, his views for the future, and so on. And just look at how Democratic presidents treat the courts in State of the Union addresses. Bill Clinton did not mention the courts once, I believe, in any State of the Union address. Barack Obama only did once in the context of sort of a shot across the bow about the Citizens United decision, if you remember that.
Not true.
Not true, right? Where Justice Alito mouths "not true" under, but he doesn't talk about appointments or nominations or confirmations or the importance of the courts in our system of government or whatever. George W. Bush mentions judicial appointments 5 times over the course of his 8 years in 5 different State of the Union addresses because his voters and the people that put him into office demonstrated that they care about this issue singularly. Democratic voters simply do not do that. Now, I know there may be people from Planned Parenthood or Earth Justice or any individual groups who are watching this and thinking, well, of course, our community cares and thinks about these issues. And that's true. There are pockets within the left that are active on judicial nominations issues as relevant to their particular issue set. But as a broad unifying thing that brings Democrats together, it's just not there. And I assure you, Ellie, next week at the Republican convention, you're going to hear repeated references to the Supreme Court and to the nominations and Mitch McConnell's success because it's just baked into the modern Republican Party in the way that it isn't with the Democrats right now.
Elizabeth, should the courts be more of a political issue? Should this be something that the Democrats are pushing more when they have the opportunity, as Elliot says, in the State of the Union or at their convention, or just when out pressing the flesh with voters? Or should we be trying to, as I believe Obama thought he was, trying to depoliticize the courts and trying to make it less of an every 4-year issue and trying to keep it kind of above the political fray?
So I think there are two different things in there. And, first of all, absolutely every voter from across the ideological spectrum should 1,000% be thinking about who they are voting for, who the person they're voting for will appoint or support or confirm putting on the bench. That is 1,000% true. That's not politicizing the judiciary. That's just a fact that we have nominations for the judiciary come from the president and confirmation coming from the Senate. And then also I would also point out that, other leaders have a role to play in suggesting candidates for the bench, et cetera. So that's just a role that our elected leaders play. And it's 1,000% something that Democrats, Republicans, independents, libertarians, whoever you vote for, you should be thinking about that. I think the claims about politicizing the courts have some more validity when you're talking about how judges, once they're on the bench, reach their outcomes, whether they're doing it to push a political agenda or whether they're following the law and the Constitution's text and history and values where it leads. But that's an entirely separate conversation than the one you just raised by the question you asked. And, I think that Elliot made a really good point that next week, I have no doubt you will be hearing from the RNC constantly about the courts, judicial nominations, and progressives need to care about that just as much, if not more, than the RNC. And I think that while it might be true that some progressive voters don't singularly vote on the courts, and frankly, that's kind of a good thing, I think that when you vote, you should think about a lot of different things. There are a lot of people who said they would vote for Donald Trump simply because of judicial nominations. And I might argue that you probably want to think about more than that when you're casting a vote for someone like that. But, the idea that progressives might not vote on a single issue like the court, they absolutely should be thinking about the courts. And I think a perfect example is, progressives care deeply about DACA, for example. And we had, or affordable health care, the ACA. DACA deadlocked when it got to the court. There wasn't a ruling on DAPA, the extension of that. And the ACA came within one vote of being struck down by the courts. So even if you're voting because you care about healthcare or because you care about immigration or you care about criminal justice, that means you also have to care about the courts because those policies live or die in the courts. You can elect a progressive House and Senate, have a progressive administration, get an amazing piece of legislation passed. And if you have judges on the bench who are pushing a conservative agenda and ignoring the law and what it actually says, then those policies will fail, even when you've put in all the hard work to elect those progressive leaders, to get that legislation passed, to get it signed by the president. It could still fail in the courts. So we've got to all care about this.
Elizabeth, I'm so glad you brought up the issue with progressive issues and progressive leaders. I certainly, and again, The Nation it tends to be a very progressive publication. I spend a lot of time talking with progressives who are worried that the current nominee, the current leadership of the Democratic Party isn't kind of sufficiently woke, isn't sufficiently on board with progressive ideas. My response to these people is usually something around the lines of, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is 87 years old. Shut up. Now, sometimes they get angry at me when I say that. And then I say, Stephen Breyer is 81 years old. Shut up. Can you explain to progressives who maybe aren't fully, as you say, they're not single issue voters, they care about a larger kind of a swath of policies. Can you explain some of the differences that you might perceive between kind of anybody that's a center to leftist Democrat might appoint versus kind of a conservative judge, a Trump judge, or pretty much anybody that McConnell, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell might confirm?
Absolutely. So first of all, your arguments, while loud, are not bad. It's incredibly important to think about Supreme Court nominations and the fact that there are likely to be very, very soon, hopefully not too soon, some vacancies on the court. And, when you're talking about, obviously, when Justice Kennedy was being replaced, he was replaced by Justice Kavanaugh. That was a huge deal, because it was sort of the, the balance of the court at issue. But even here, when we're talking about, for example, Justice Ginsburg or Justice Breyer, replacing those justices with a conservative, with whoever, if there is a conservative president elected, and I don't care whether it's someone who's an extreme conservative or just, kind of the conservative that we were used to before a Republican president like Donald Trump, they will be putting in a justice in there who is most likely, if any of the most recent nominees from Republican administrations are any indication, who will not support progressive policies, even when they fully comply and are enforcing the Constitution and our statutes. And I want to say that you've got to think about this because it isn't just a 4-year or an 8-year problem. President Trump, for example, even if he is defeated in the next election and many of his policies of cruelty and perpetuating white supremacism, even if those policies can be erased with an election, his Supreme Court nominations will not. And those folks will be on the bench for decades. And so when you're talking about a progressive agenda, getting progressive judges on the courts is just as, in some ways, more important than winning the next election, although you can't do that without winning an election, so they go hand in hand. But we're talking about decades of influence. And so if we get conservative justices replacing 2 of the more liberal justices, we are going to see an extraordinary conservative shift in the law. And again, that doesn't just limit itself to the court. That impacts every single aspect of life and the law and politics that progressives care about, whether it's abortion access, LGBTQ rights, criminal justice, things like qualified immunity and police accountability, environmental protection, consumer protection, the ability of big corporations to influence elections and drown out the voice of everyday citizens and voters, immigration. If we have a conservative Supreme Court, even if progressives win elections and pass laws, it will be very hard for them to survive. So the courts and the future of this country could not be more on the ballot this year.
Elliot, assuming that people understand that message and they go and they vote for the Democratic nominee for president, then the job is done, right? Is there, another branch of government that also has a role to play in all this?
Yeah. We should talk about the Schoolhouse Rock 3-ring government. It's totally a circus and a branch of government. But no, certainly it's the Senate, and people need to lean on their senators. And frankly, elect a Senate that reflects the will of the people. Or, I'm not going to, whatever, elect the right Senate. We'll leave it at that. But no, certainly that is a question. Now, again, and even responding to one of the comments that we had about whether Democrats care about voting and so on. It's, and again, I don't mean to begrudge Democratic voters and say that they are liberal voters and say that they don't vote on judges, but it's just sort of far more baked into the notion of modern conservatism that judges are a thing that is critical, and sort of these questions of, so some of these, anyway. So no, I think it's important to think about the United States Senate and frankly, the Senate, the rules of the United States Senate. I know one of the contentious issues is whether to alter the rules of the Senate to facilitate the easy confirmation of judges. And that's an important conversation to have when, as Elizabeth is talking about, you're talking about an existential question for the United States of America. And I just think, backing up for a quick second, and Elliot, I want to thank you for your writing and work around this issue of sort of a half loaf and the candidate or the people who represent not your point of view, but this sort of saving America from the brink of all kinds of problems. And you've written quite eloquently, both on Twitter and in your writing for The Nation, that you may not be on board with a particular leader or a particular government, but the alternative is so profoundly bad and so profoundly dangerous that I hesitate to say you ought to hold your nose, but that's when the process of negotiating over what 100% is and where we want to be as a nation ought to come in. But this whole question of just looking at the appointments that any Republican president, but particularly Donald Trump, has, just look at the appointments he's made and the nature of where he shifted the federal judiciary across the board. We can talk about individual. You can talk about the Fourth Circuit, which briefly was mildly progressive for about 15 minutes about 10 years ago, and now has shifted back firmly with the number of appointments. The 11th Circuit, where I once clerked, which is once again shifting very firmly to the right, and this is just consistently happening across the federal appeals courts in the nation. So people, not even as they go to the ballot box, but just as they think about politics and think about the United States Senate and think about the presidency and just think about their values generally. What do you want, and what is the America you wish to have? Is it the ideal? Well, certainly we all could live in an ideal world. Or is it the alternative, which is a very frightening one?
Elizabeth, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, and I just want to add something to what Elliot said, and I totally agree with him on that. I'm grateful for your writing on this as well. And just because you elect someone, whether it's a senator or a president, who has a role to play in judicial nominations, that doesn't mean that your role as a progressive activist ends. Because you see it on the conservative side, it's not just about getting someone in office who will put conservatives or progressives on the bench. It's also, after that person gets elected or that Senate gets elected, who they choose within that category. And, we've seen on the left a broad swath of the types of people who are nominated to these positions. And, the DNC platform, I think, should be lauded for noting that we should have nominees who reflect the diversity of this beautiful nation, which President Trump's nominees 1,000% do not. They're pretty much all white men. And, not just that, but also the diversity of, the DNC platform talks about, having people across the legal practice, so people who are not just big law partners. But, progressive activists, I think, even if they might be, as Elliot said, you hate to use the term, holding their nose to vote for, a certain presidential ticket. Once that administration gets into office, they should 1,000% be pushing for judicial nominees who are more liberal than maybe even the president who'll be nominating them on issues like ending qualified immunity for police officers and other state actors, or people who, recognize the importance of enforcing environmental protections when the EPA hopefully at some point goes back to protecting the environment, or people who will, recognize the importance of labor protections and consumer protections when they're enacted into law, and the importance of abortion access. There is a range of so-called liberal justices on the Supreme Court, the liberal bloc, which people like to just sort of all lump in together. There are differences between those justices. There are differences in people that Democratic administrations have put on the bench. And if you don't want them to be, older male big law partners, you would like to see a public defender in there, you would like to see a civil rights lawyer in there, which I would, you can advocate for that even after you've cast that initial ballot that maybe is not for the ticket that would be your dream ticket.
Yeah, I've often said that the way to balance, if there's an elephant sitting on one side of the seesaw, the way to balance it is not to put a donkey in the middle of the seesaw. It's just going to slide down into the elephant. The way to balance it is put an elephant on the other side of the seesaw and let's go. I want to come back to the diversity point, but before I get too far off of the politics of this all, I just want to ask either of you, kind of rapid fire, do you think that we live in a world where we will see any Supreme Court nominee confirmed in an era of divided government? So, Trump has right now the White House, the Republicans have the White House and the Senate right now. They can get whoever they want. If we ever find ourselves in a situation where one party controls the White House and a different party controls the Senate, do you think we live in a world where it's possible to get any judicial nominees at all?
Can I say, okay, I think it's a question of which party's in power, and it's a question of how dirty Democrats are willing to play. It literally, and some of this, I don't say this to vilify conservatives or Republicans, but baked into the notion of conservatism is that government is inherently bad and it ought to be blown up and the rules and norms can be violated. Again, that's it's sort of the essence of big government lowercase g government versus small government. Liberals tend to believe, and well, the president made a nomination, so even though it's a different party, necessarily we should just, because that's just the way government works, and we have to adhere to the norms of government. It's almost a philosophical point, and I'm not convinced that a Democratic president, and maybe even the next Democratic president, would be willing to sort of blow up the rules or the norms in such a way as to not confirm, the Democrat, you know what I mean, a Democratic Senate with a Republican president.
So you don't think your old boss Chuck Schumer would blow the whole thing up to block every nominee up and down the system?
You know, I think my old boss of a couple of years ago versus my old boss of today are two different my old bosses, and I think there is just different. We're in a different. I think post Merrick Garland, I think we are in, which is, you know, for folks, everyone who's watching this knows who Merrick Garland is, but for folks who don't, the 2016, after Justice Scalia died in early 2016, Mitch McConnell refused to confirm Merrick Garland, which was Barack Obama's.
Right? So, acted like you, right? Elizabeth, what do you think? Do you think that we will ever have a nominee? And again, not just for the Supreme Court, like up and down the system, in an era of divided government?
You know, I think in a lot of ways it depends on the people. You know, if there's enough pressure, the people can make a difference. You know, and I know I'm like a sunny Californian, and so I'm always optimistic. But like, I really do believe that, and I think we saw it with healthcare. You know, I mean, you had like the big Republican establishment politicians wanting to tear down the ACA, and because there was nationwide outcry, they couldn't get the votes. And so I think if there is a, you know, nationwide outcry that you can't hold the Supreme Court hostage, because the Supreme Court does really important things, the courts do really important things, then, you know, I think that it could happen. You know, I do think that there has been an unfortunate capitulation by progressive senators. You know, even when they could be voting to stop particularly egregious nominees, they don't always put up a big fight. And those fights are worth having. You know, it's not just at the Supreme Court when they're worth having. They're worth having on the appellate courts. Heck, they're worth having on the district courts, because, you know, when you think about the cases that most affect people's lives, you know, day in and day out, people who interact with the criminal justice system, people who are trying to, you know, hold, you know, big business or their employers accountable, people who've, you know, gotten screwed as a little guy, like those cases most of the time don't make it to the Supreme Court. So every judge matters. And I feel like progressive senators have not put up a fight when they should. So I'm not there hasn't been a great demonstration of that. You know, maybe Elliot can talk to his old boss and put in a few, you know, attaboys for the times when he has put up a fight. But we should be demanding that from our leaders because it's their job.
Elliot, you want to get back in here?
Yeah, two things. One, both Ellie and I are not sunny Californians, but cynical, dark New Yorkers. And so that might be, anyway. So we might differ on that there. You know, it's interesting. Responding to your point a little bit earlier, Elizabeth, too. It's not just, I would even go further and say, it's not just that there are differences within the quote unquote, quote, left side of the court. The simple fact is, and maybe we can talk about this more, Ellie, sort of who they are like on the liberal conservative spectrum compared to justices of 40 years ago. They're actually just not that liberal. And I don't say, and look, I say this, you both know me as a former federal prosecutor and sort of one of those non-activisty types you were bemoaning a little bit earlier, but just look at the nature of their backgrounds and the nature of their rulings. And they're actually just sort of center-left, left-leaning moderates, all of them. It compared to looking at sort of William Brennan, William O. Douglas, Thurgood Marshall, the justices of 30 or 40 years ago, where there was just the left on the court meant something totally different than it does today.
Elliot, that's an absolutely great point, and it's something I am. Let's get into this right now. One of the issues that I have with the courts right now isn't just a question of kind of racial and gender diversity. I mean, we've already kind of hit upon the fact that Trump's appointees have been overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, and that just goes through the Republican Party as a whole. This is not a party that it's not a party that respects diversity, much less a party that embraces diversity. And I expect that if Democrats are ever in power again, and that's still an if, that we will see much more kind of rainbow diversity in terms of the kind of people they appoint. I would look, if you're a white male cis hetero liberal, like, you might have to wait in some lines before you get appointed anything for a bit. Just saying. But what and this goes to what you already kind of brought up, Elliot. Where I really see the dearth is in intellectual diversity on the courts. The Supreme Court right now, there are only 2 law schools represented on the Supreme Court, mine and Elizabeth's. Sorry, Elliot. But 2 law schools on the entire court. Most of the judges have either a federal prosecutorial background, a corporate law background, or were law professors. I think almost all the judges clerked for some other judge, usually at the circuit Court of Appeals level, if not the Supreme Court level. We're talking about a very small swath of American society that gets themselves even into the position of being a lifetime appointed federal judge. How do we expand the intellectual diversity in the third branch of government? I'm honestly starting from the standpoint of the third branch being the least representative of America branch of all 3. So how do we break through the intellectual barriers to get a more diverse kind of grouping of people onto the bench? Elliot's book last. Elizabeth, you first.
Yeah, so I think that, we absolutely, as voters and as donors and as people who have influence in one way or another, need to demand it, because it's not just something that progressives should do because that's what progressives do, and it's important to have diversity. It's because it's honestly the best thing for our justice system and the best thing for our country to have people who are Black and brown and indigenous, LGBTQ, trans, with disabilities. That is going to bring excellence to our judicial system. It's not just about checking off boxes. It's about putting the best people on the bench. And honestly, I want a nominee who has diversity of experience. Someone who, I'm a better human, I'm a better lawyer because I represented people who are, facing the huge criminal justice system, prosecutors like Elliot, who have their lives in their hands. And to be in an empathetic position with that person and see the challenges they face and represent them in court, have the honor of representing them in court, representing immigrants who are fleeing from violence and persecution, who, again, it's not a criminal case, but it is a death penalty case for a lot of these immigrants. And, I'm a better person, I'm a better lawyer, and I know that a person who had those experiences, as opposed to just being a corporate lawyer, would be a better lawyer. They understand the way that the law affects people. And, I think that we should just simply demand that. And I think that, for people who, this is during the DNC, so there are people who are at fundraisers. Ask about that. Ask candidates about this. Make it something that you are asking for when they are asking for your vote, and then follow up on that, and I think that, we're obviously talking in this context. And so it's about our votes. It's about putting pressure on. And again, it's not just the president or the people within the White House who will be doing the vetting. It's also about who we put in the pipeline. And so it's important to make sure that we have people that really know the way the law gets into your daily life, people who know the way that police accountability and having the courts do away with the judge-made doctrine of qualified immunity that allows police to perpetuate white supremacist violence, basically with impunity. They know the importance of getting rid of that doctrine if they get on the bench, because it has no basis in the law and it violates the values of our Constitution's guarantees of equality and liberty. And so we've got to just demand it. We've got to follow up on it. We've got to make sure that the president and the people in the White House know it, that people who are in the Senate doing the job of confirming or voting against nominees know it. And then the people who are in positions to give names for the pipeline know it and put those names forward that we as progressives want them to put forward, and not just sort of let them go with the guy who gave them a lot of money and he was, some like old big law partner. But that's not okay. We should ask for more.
Elliot, Joe Biden went to Syracuse Law. That makes him qualified to be president, but it wouldn't make him close to be qualified for a Supreme Court justice. How do we get more people from places like Syracuse Law on the bench?
I think it's the legal profession needs to get off of its fetish with credentials. This is something that we all know as three members of the profession, and frankly, three members of the profession who went to elite law schools. But that's baked into the legal profession. And if you look at law firms and on down, they all tend to reflect that, clerkships and so on. So number one, it starts with the legal profession as a sort of broader societal institution needs to get off that, right? Number one. Number two, this gets to Elizabeth's point about the isms that exist in society because of who's there. So the notion, so you just take systemic racism in society, right? Which we all, at least the three of us and many of the people watching here, would acknowledge the existence of. Systemic racism exists because the people who have been in positions of power, elected officials, the courts, simply have been predominantly white for our nation's entire history. And so, for instance, Vice President Biden has talked about putting the first Black woman on the Supreme Court, which is, and again, there's a lot of beautiful and wonderful diversity, Ellie, as you know, Elizabeth, as you know, within Black people. We know this. However, a big step is putting a Black woman on the Supreme Court, making a priority to do so, and making a priority to have that kind of diversity be a part of the process. I know that there's a campaign starting with an organization called She Will Rise. Sista SCOTUS is their Twitter handle. It created and stood up for this specific purpose and for supporting this. And so I think until a lot of these questions around diversity are answered in the legal profession and in the system of nominations, we're going to continue to have just some of the societal ills that we've been talking about. But again, Ellie, I do think a big part of it is the legal profession in general, one. And two, again, as progressives, this focus on federal prosecutors and law firm partners. And again, we've all talked about me as the former prosecutor, but it just needs to stop. And there are many wonderful prosecutors, apolitical, far left-leaning, far right-leaning that I worked with and know, and so on. But somehow the only ones who seem to get nominated to the courts are not, or people who seem to get nominated are not federal public defenders or are not activists and so on. And I think that will have an impact on the kinds of decisions that are coming down. And so certainly, political leaders need to get more aggressive about nominating people with diverse backgrounds.
I just want to say, take a little moderator's privilege here and say to our listeners that I find this discussion about intellectual diversity to be the same as the discussion about racial or ethnic or gender diversity. I fervently believe that we would have a more diverse bench if we, just racially speaking, if we had more intellectual diversity on the bench. And I'll give just a little quick personal story on this. Like so many African Americans, I was the first person in my family to go to law school. Not the first person to graduate from college, and I'm very proud of that, but proud of them to not have been, but certainly the first person in my family to go to law school. And so there was no way that I knew that something like clerkship was important. Right? Like I didn't know any Supreme Court clerks. I didn't know that was a thing that I should aspire to, right? I went to law school with a whole lot of debt, and I came out wanting to make some bank, all right? I needed to pay some debts when I got out of law school. So there was a whole pipeline of kind of taking me from a kind of 1L that I could have gotten onto to lead me into a potential, Supreme Court appointment. Obviously, I would never be an actual judge because my mouth runs too fast. But there's a whole pipeline I didn't even know of, right? And I went to an elite law school. Imagine how difficult it is for people who don't go to elite law schools, who are the first people in their family to go to college, much less law school, who don't have lawyers and doctors and other people in their families and in their communities that can kind of push them along the way. If we expand our definition as to what a judge is, to include people who come from some less traditional backgrounds and from some non-elite schools, we will, by definition, expand our definition of what a judge looks like. So that's one of the reasons why I just think it's so important to always think through, are we being intellectually as diverse as possible? Because the racial and the gender equality will come through that as well as much as anything. Before we open it up to questions, I gotta ask you guys about trying to pin you guys down on what actual reforms, if any, you want to see in our judiciary, right? There are lots of ideas flowing around right now, from court packing to term limits. Is there any particular reform that you want to see that you think that would make a huge difference on our bench? Elizabeth, you first.
Yeah, so, I think something that's very easy and very doable and is perhaps one of the silver linings of this whole COVID situation is increased transparency in the Supreme Court. Before COVID, if you wanted to see what the nation's highest court was doing or hear it in real time, you had to go to Washington, probably hire a line sitter or sit in line in the public line for literally days. Even as a member of the Supreme Court bar, you probably have to get there at 5 o'clock in the morning and stand in line to get in. And then there are only a few dozen seats inside. That is preposterous that is true when you have the Supreme Court hearing cases, just looking at this past term about abortion access, about immigration and DACA, about issues related to civil rights. So the fact that we have had live audio from the Supreme Court during COVID when they had to move to remote arguments, I think is just a step forward to increasing transparency. And I think that would actually do a lot to get people engaged with the court, because it would be something that's more real to them. I think that it would make it more of the part of Americans' experience of government. I'm not going to say that the average American tunes into C-SPAN, but the fact is we do get to see people come onto the floor of Congress and talk about things. We do get to see these big hearings, and the fact that we don't get to see that from the court, and prior to COVID, you could only hear the argument when it was released later, and that was just the audio. And, you had I think, who was it? Stephen Colbert, who had the dogs acted out, which, okay. But so I think that is a very easy reform that could very easily be done. And I don't want to talk about court packing.
Elizabeth, I'm going to push you though on the one that you said, right? So as a person, you have to argue in front of these people. Are you worried that cameras in the courtroom or same day audio, are you worried that could lead to grandstanding from lawyers? I think back to one of the, lowest moments of this era when the Trump lawyer had to get up there and argue that little kids don't deserve toothbrushes. I don't think that's an argument she makes. If she understands that there's a camera in her face at all times, if she understands that people are going to hear that, I don't think that's an argument that she makes. Now, I think that's a good thing in terms of that's a terrible argument. But you could argue, legally speaking, that you should feel free to make whatever arguments you need to advance the interests of your client. And if a camera staring you in the face is going to, have a chilling effect on you as a lawyer, or is a camera staring you in the face going to have a grandstanding effect on you as a lawyer?
So, I don't think it honestly matters. Look, probably the grandstanding that goes on in the court goes on already because you're grandstanding for the other people in the room whose opinions you really care about. Certain justices, I think, like to show off in various ways, whether it's by making jokes or whatever already. So I don't think they need cameras to do that. But I do think, and look, it's already public. So if something outrageous happens, like exactly what you said, children don't need toothbrushes, that's going to get out anyway. And then I also think that, we should see what some of the justices do. I mean, I will never forget, being in the room when Justice Scalia said some of the most incredibly offensive things during the arguments about race-conscious admissions programs, when he talked about the Voting Rights Act being a racial entitlement. I want those things to be on camera. I want people to see that and to know that that's what a justice of the Supreme Court is saying. And so are those the kind of justices that you want on the court, who think that the right to vote free from discrimination is a racial entitlement? Or who make suggestions about the intelligence and ability of Black students, that should be on camera and we should see that. And if that makes them think twice about saying things, hopefully it'll make them think twice about thinking those things, and certainly make them think twice about putting them into their judicial rulings.
Elliot, what's your reform?
Yeah, I would second the transparency point, and it's on this big issue. Why are courts, this gets back to what we were saying earlier about the elitism of the legal community. And why are courts so different? Why do we treat the law as so different than any other function of government, that there's been this reflexive pushback on putting courts that it would ruin the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is too special and too lofty? Come on, that's nonsense. Like, it is our government, and the people have certainly maybe not an entitlement to know what's happening in it, but certainly the right to be able to see freely without jumping through hoops how the proceedings take place. So I just feel like the world has overvalued, or many people in the legal community have overvalued, this risk of courts being tainted by the whims of the ordinary people who would be watching the proceedings play out and so on. It's it's tricky. Like, I understand as a lawyer that the law can be complex and hard and dry. Well, so what? Then let it be law, let it be complex and dry. And people who can, and as Elizabeth had said, when justices make egregious comments or particularly profound ones, then certainly the public should be able to see them. But it is striking that somehow we've treated the Supreme Court and the judiciary generally with kid gloves, that somehow it is this special. Because, for instance, part of that stems from the fact that the judiciary is an apolitical branch and is not subject to, it does not behave in the same manner as the two dirty political. Well, come on, it's just as political as any other branch out there. You know it, I know it, everybody knows it. So this idea that it's entitled to this balloon of protection around it, and that justices couldn't do their jobs effectively with cameras there, is just nonsense.
I can't get either of you to come out for term limits.
It's interesting.
Trump is out here putting, the guy the kid who won the mock trial tournament, in a lifetime seat, and are we real? Here's my argument for term limits. All right, our Constitution was written in a time when people used to die because they didn't have access to Robitussin. Surely their framers in their infinite wisdom did not expect people to wield power for 30 or 40 years on the bench. Is it not time, Elliot or Elizabeth, is it not time for us to put some limit on how long these people can serve?
Well, look, Ellie, there's all kinds of areas of life, and marriage is different now because people are living 5 or 6 decades longer than they used to. So every aspect of American life is changed by life expectancy. So, but what I would say, and this might be a little more politic than my activist friend from the nation might have said, but I think a new Congress and a new president ought to consider term limits, court expansion, transparency measures, ought to consider them as a package of how do we make the judiciary more reflective, and how do we make the decisions that come to just more legally sound, and diversity on the court, and so on. I think they ought to consider these things. Now, whether one or the other is the silver bullet for saving us, I just don't know and can't answer that today. And I'm reluctant to answer that today, but I think that's where I'd go with it.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I joked about not wanting to talk about court packing. That's partly because I don't like that framing, because I think if we do really need to expand the number of judges or justices, then I think that's something that we should take on its own terms. And, doing that wouldn't be court packing. It would just be making sure the courts function properly. So that's partly why I, jokingly didn't want to talk about that. And I do think there's a very good argument that's not a political argument for expanding the number of judges in certain courts, because their workload is very high. And in some cases, the wheels of justice turn even more slowly than they do as a general matter. And so I think that, that is something that should be considered up and down. And, I think also, thinking about things like term limits, I think it should be considered. But I guess where I have a problem is sometimes when people think that those reforms are, where progressives put them forward because they think that that's going to cure the problems that they see with the courts. And I do not think that that is true. I think what will solve the problem of having conservative judges do things on the courts that is pushing a conservative political agenda instead of following the Constitution's guarantees of equality and liberty and justice is not going to go away simply because we, enact some reforms. It's going to go away when we put progressive justices on the court, when we fight those conservative nominees. So I think it's something that should be considered absolutely, just as, modernizing and looking at better ways for justice to function efficiently is always a good thing, but it's not going to be a silver bullet.
Elliot, you want to get in here?
One tiny point on expanding lower courts or just looking at the number, like a concrete example that I can speak from personal experience. When I clerked on the 11th Circuit, it was a while ago now, but at that time, the 11th Circuit was the only judicial circuit in the country where each judge was approved to have 5 clerks on account of the fact that the workload in the 11th Circuit is so overwhelming. Now, some of this goes back to the fact that for those of you who know the history, the 11th Circuit was formerly the 5th Circuit. All of the southeastern United States was one circuit. They cut it in half in 1981, but then what you ended up with is Florida, Alabama, and Georgia in this decade, in this generation, just being overloaded with work. They're 2 big, populous states where people sue each other a lot, where cops do a lot of bad stuff to people, and federal courts end up overworked. You compare that to the First Circuit, which is the northeastern United States, which I think has 6 sitting judges approved on the 6th Circuit. It's First Circuit. It's just a smaller circuit. So we could have a big look at what is the workload, and even setting aside politics, but what is the workload on a day-to-day level of these courts? And it's just not equal. We know that for a fact now, and that's an important question that Congress ought to consider right now.
I think Congress ought to consider the workload on the current Supreme Court, where they choose their own docket. They don't hear as many cases as they used to. Look, I'm a big fan of court packing, court reform, court expansion, whatever you want to call it. I want more people on the court, as Kermit the Frog said. I want more dogs and cats and chickens and things. Look, and just on the non-political point, I think that there is a great argument to be made of having cases in panel on the first instance. All the lower circuits work on a panel system. That's a random draw of judges. I think that having most cases in the first instance heard by a 3-judge random lot in and of itself decreases the appearance of partisanship on the courts. So I'm a big, and you can have that if you had 19 Supreme Court justices. So I'm a big fan of all kinds of expansion. I want to go to a question from our audience, Elizabeth Sunshine Roberts. What impact could adding new states, DC or Puerto Rico, have on the judiciary, especially in terms of a progressive agenda? So let's say that DC and Puerto Rico are granted statehood. What do you think that does to the courts? Like, what circuit are they in? Let's go.
Yeah, so they're already in circuits. So the DC is in the DC circuit, and Puerto Rico is in the First Circuit. So they're already there. But I think the real crucial way in which adding them right now would have an impact on the judiciary is by adding senators, because they would get senatorial representation, and likely that would mean more progressive senators. And think about how the vote would have been different on Justice Kavanaugh if we had progressive senators from DC and Puerto Rico. And, I think that is a good thing for the judiciary, but more important, I think it's just a good thing for political equality. As a DC resident myself, I think it's preposterous that we live here and have license plates that say taxation without representation, and we don't have a full voice in government.
Yeah, I would say something slightly different, but largely the same, which is, I almost feel like the wrong framing for that question for the statehood for DC and Puerto Rico is, well, what would the political impact be? And more on the second point Elizabeth makes, which is that it's just a different America than the America in which the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico became sort of territories of the United States. And so the notion of DC as this sovereign place where members of Congress would periodically come to and cast their votes and leave. It's just a different place. It is now literally more people than Wyoming or whatever, the statistics and so on. So it becomes an equality and an enfranchisement question far more than a political one. Yeah, well, look, under current voting patterns, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico would likely vote Democratic, but to some extent, that's the subordinate issue to just the basic human and civil and American rights question of lots of people who wish to be full citizens of the United States, which you know what I mean, but to enjoy all of the benefits of citizenship and all the rewards despite paying taxes. And given how much conservatives crow about taxes and taxation and what it all means, that's where we should be focused our efforts, I think.
Look, I always say if conservatives are worried about DC and Puerto Rico being too liberal, they can always try to convince them.
Yeah, win the
have an actual argument.
Democracy.
That's exactly it. It's people say you hear that argument made, which is it's just handing Democrats votes and convince the people in the District of Columbia that there are a couple independent members of the city council, but convince them that your views are right and perhaps you win.
Make an argument. All right, last question here from Christine Kippens. What should a Biden-Harris administration and or Democratic senator prioritize concerning the courts in the first 6 months of 2021? I want to get us out of here on a raw politics question because we are in convention season. What's the hammer? What's the first 100 days hammer that a new Democratic administration should think about should they win in 2021?
Okay. I'll just say bullet point for the lightning round really quick. One, the economy. We need to stabilize it and ensure that people have the security and safety that they need because we're just in trouble. The nation is in trouble now and burning. So obviously stimulus the economy is the top priority of everyone. Number one. Number two, the courts, obviously, and prioritizing judicial nominations and making them in a way that Barack Obama just simply didn't. Right. And number three, immigration. I think the nation is in sore, dire need of immigration reform, and that needs to happen stat.
So I think even before the 6 months start, there needs to be a list of people who are going to be nominated. And, we need to learn the lessons from the Obama administration where they had an extremely slow start of putting judges on the bench, and that was with a sympathetic Senate. So that was a real squandering of opportunity. And making sure that those names are people who are going to be on the bench for decades, who aren't going to take senior status after just a few years, which happened with some of the Obama nominees, which was extremely frustrating to kind of work so hard to get them through and then have to go through the same thing again. So, people who are going to be on the courts for a long time, people who represent the excellence and beauty of America and all its diversity, people who are from progressive backgrounds, who are civil rights lawyers, who are public defenders, who worked in labor, who have worked in abortion rights, people who understand the way that the law really impacts Americans. And I just want to say on this that I'm actually really hopeful that there could be a really strong running start with a progressive Biden-Harris administration because we have Kamala Harris on the ballot. She has been a real superstar in the Judiciary Committee. I think a lot of people remember her from her questioning of Justice Kavanaugh, but she's been great across the board in the Judiciary Committee. And so, this is probably Elliot's world more than mine, but if Kamala Harris were to be in charge of judges as part of her portfolio, I think that would be something that she would just crush. And so, you know, having someone like that in the White House is, I think, a real benefit to those of us who care about the courts and care about who gets nominated, especially out of the gate.
If only we had a former Obama administration official here who could speak to why the president, who was also a constitutional lawyer, was so slow out of the gate on this particular issue.
So I'll tell you exactly. I mean, again, I didn't work judges, and certainly not in the first term where I was over at the Department of Homeland Security. But I think, number one, healthcare sucked a lot of energy out of the first 2 years in terms of priorities. And number two, this gets back to what we were talking about, the sort of failure of the progressive left to make judges a thing. And I think that sort of infected the last progressive president, or the last, whatever you want to call Barack Obama as president. But I think it's those two things. The president was extremely successful at nominating diverse judges. Again, we've talked about 99 or 97% of Trump's, not whatever the number is, being white or white men or so on. And that simply wasn't the case with Barack Obama and the folks that they put on. But in terms of nominating and confirming people with the alacrity that the Trump administration is putting people on, it just simply wasn't there. But no, I think it was. I think it's twofold. I think it was healthcare being, and again, the question, a skeptical person would be right to ask, well, why can't you walk and chew gum at the same time? And part of that is Congress can only really take on one major priority at a time. And I do think it was healthcare back then. But you'd have to ask a White House official, not just an Obama administration official. That's just my view. But no, it wasn't. But look, we are seeing the effects of it today, which is that, as Elizabeth had said, people who were older and put on the bench and are now retiring already, being replaced by Trump appointees who are 34 years old and so on. So it was definitely a problem, and I would even go as far as to say a failure, a legacy securing failure that the administration oversaw.
I completely agree. Thank you guys so much for attending. Thank you guys so much for listening to us, and I'm happy that this is kind of the note that we're ending on, because if there is one thing that I want you to take away, look, you came to this panel, you care about the courts, you care about what's going on, you care about the third branch of government. You have to keep caring after the election, because if we don't keep the energy and the fire and the push going on after the election, that's when we can lose ground. So remember about the courts, not just on November 3rd, but certainly on January 21st. Thank you for the Constitutional Accountability Center for having us. Thank you for the Raben Group for hosting us. Thanks for coming, and have a nice rest of your week.